Simone Ashworth was 39 years old, and for 14 years she had been the quiet architecture behind a marriage everyone assumed was ordinary. She drove a 12-year-old pickup with primer gray fenders. She wore steel toe boots to job sites and clearance rack blouses to his family's Sunday dinners. His mother called her Practical Simone and never once asked what she actually did for a living beyond something with buildings. On a Tuesday in October, she came home 40 minutes early from a site inspection and found her husband, Marcus, standing in the driveway with 2 suitcases and an apology already rehearsed on his face. He told her he was leaving. He told her he had been in love with someone else for over a year. He told her, almost gently, that the someone else was Talia, the girl he had grown up next door to, the woman Simone had once called a sister. $212,000 had moved out of their joint accounts in the 14 months before he said a single word of it out loud. What Marcus never thought to ask, not once in 14 years, was why his wife's name was the only signature on the deed to her late father's engineering firm, or why she kept a second phone locked in a drawer that had nothing to do with an affair and everything to do with a life he had never once asked about. He believed he was walking away holding all the leverage. He had no idea what he was actually giving up, or whose face would be waiting across a table from him 9 months later, in the exact moment his composure finally broke. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 3 weeks before that Tuesday, the morning had started the way most of Simone's mornings started. The coffee was still too hot to drink. She stood at the kitchen counter with both hands wrapped around the mug, looking down at the hexagonal tile floor she had laid herself the summer her father got sick. 1 piece at a time, leveling each tile by hand, because he had taught her that a floor was only as honest as the work underneath it. Her father used to say, "A woman who builds her own foundation never has to beg for shelter." Walter Ashworth had been dead 3 years by then, but his voice still showed up in the quiet moments, usually right when she needed it. She picked up the mug and rinsed it and set it in the rack, not out of habit, out of the same discipline her father had drilled into her 20 years earlier, because an engineer who could not keep her own kitchen in order had no business signing off on anyone else's foundation. She had met Marcus at a fundraiser for the community college's construction program, back when he was 26 and charming in the uncomplicated way of a man who had never had to work very hard to be liked. He asked her what she did. She told him she was an engineer. He said that made sense. She had steady hands. He walked her to her truck that night and told her, only half joking, that he liked a woman who didn't need him to carry anything for her. She had laughed at the time. She would think about that line again, years later, and hear it differently. She married him 2 years later in her father's backyard, under the oak tree Walter had planted the year she was born. Walter had walked her down a row of folding chairs instead of an aisle, leaned in close before he let her go, and told her that a man worth marrying was one who got quieter, not louder, the more he learned about her. She had believed, for a long time, that Marcus was that kind of man. Talia had been around for as long as Marcus had. She had stood at their wedding in a pale green dress, holding a bouquet she had picked out herself, crying real tears during the vows. She came to Thanksgiving. She remembered Simone's shoe size. Nobody in either family had ever once looked at the two of them and thought to ask a single question, because some kinds of closeness get mistaken for safety simply because they are old. That morning, Marcus kissed her cheek on his way out the door, smelling faintly of a cologne she didn't remember him owning. His phone sat face down on the counter, which wasn't unusual, except that he picked it up and slid it into his jacket pocket without glancing at it, which was. Her own phone, the sleeker, newer one, stayed exactly where it always stayed, zipped into the inside pocket of her work bag, unknown to him. Only her attorney and her uncle knew the whole shape of what that phone actually connected to. Marcus had never asked. She had never offered. She was watching. She had been watching, quietly, for longer than she could admit even to herself. That evening, her office manager forwarded her an odd message. A woman from a title company had called twice asking to confirm an appraisal appointment on a rental property Simone had never heard of. Simone read the message twice, standing very still in her own kitchen. She didn't call Marcus about it. She didn't call anyone. She simply saved the message in a folder on her desktop. The same way her father had once told her to save every invoice, every discrepancy, every number that didn't add up on its own. Some things, he used to say, you don't ask about out loud. You just start keeping records. 3 weeks passed the way weeks do when a person is choosing not to look too closely at what is right in front of them. Then came the Tuesday. The suitcases. The rehearsed apology. Talia's name landing in the driveway like something dropped from a height. What she hadn't told anyone yet, what she barely let herself think in full sentences, was that some small, steady part of her hadn't been surprised at all. She did not confront Marcus in the driveway. She did not ask a single question. She helped him carry one of the suitcases to his car, because her father had also taught her that dignity costs nothing and buys everything. That night, after his taillights disappeared down the street, she sat down at the shared computer in the study, the one he always forgot to log out of, and she began, calmly, to look. Her hands didn't shake. The email account was still open. 11 months of messages between Marcus and someone saved only as T. B. She read through them in order, oldest to newest, the way she would read through a set of blueprints, looking not for the drama of it, but for the load-bearing details. Hotel confirmations in 3 different cities. A florist receipt paid from an account she didn't recognize. A message, dated back in February, that read simply, "She still doesn't know. She won't figure it out. She never does." He had no idea, sitting on that account 11 months deep and never once thinking to log out, how much of it she would find, or how quickly. Her face remained perfectly calm reading that line. She printed it anyway. She also found the second phone he thought she would never notice. An older model kept charging in the bottom of his gym bag. The passcode nothing more complicated than her own father's birthday, a detail that told her more about Marcus's carelessness than any single line of text ever could. Voicemails on it were addressed to Bear, a nickname Talia had apparently used since they were children, back when closeness was still innocent, and long before anyone had thought to make it complicated. Over the following 4 days, without raising her voice to a single person, she built a timeline. A cash advance here. A withdrawal there. $46,000 moved across 9 months into an account with Talia's name quietly attached as a joint signer. An account Simone had never been told existed. On a marriage where she had been listed on every mortgage, every tax filing, every piece of shared debt for 14 years. You didn't need to be a structural engineer to recognize the shape of a building that had been hollowed out slowly. From the inside, while its owner kept insisting nothing was wrong. She cross-referenced the dates against his old calendar, still synced to the shared cloud account neither of them had ever bothered to change. 3 business trips to Charleston that had no corresponding hotel folio anywhere in either of their accounts. A dentist appointment that lined up, suspiciously well, with a credit card charge from a jewelry counter 40 minutes from the dentist's office. None of it, on its own, would have meant much. Stacked together, in order, It read like a set of drawings for a building that was never going to hold the weight it claimed it could. She found something else in that same folder of documents, tucked behind a request for a home equity line. An email from Marcus to a real estate attorney, dated 8 months earlier, asking whether a spouse's ownership stake in a family business could be classified as marital property subject to division, even if her name was the only one on the paperwork. He hadn't just been leaving. He had been pricing her out first. She thought about her father then, the two of them out in the garage on Saturday mornings, him teaching her to read stress fractures in old lumber before he ever taught her to read a textbook. Some cracks, he used to say, don't show up on the surface until the whole thing is already coming down. She had run her father's firm on quiet competence for 6 years since his death. Majority owner of Ashworth Structural Group, in name only to the outside world. Because Walter Ashworth had wanted her protected from exactly this kind of man, and had drawn up the trust that way himself, 18 months before he died, without ever telling Marcus a word of it. Marcus had spent 14 years married to a woman he never once asked a real question about. And he was about to find out that the parts of her life he'd found boring were the parts that were going to determine what was left of his. She opened a new folder on her laptop. She named it simply Marcus. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she knew would understand exactly what she needed. 3 days later, she sat across from Patricia Boykin in an office that smelled like coffee and old case files. Patricia had built her practice on cases exactly like this one, the kind where the husband assumed a modest woman meant modest resources, and she reviewed Simone's folder without a single flinch, turning each page slowly, the way a person reads something they have seen far too many times to be surprised by anymore. "You did all of this yourself," Patricia said, not quite a question. "I document things for a living," Simone said. "I just hadn't turned it on him before." "Good," Patricia said. "Now we make sure he never sees it coming." Preparation, Patricia told her on the way out, was the only kind of power that never runs out. The following weekend, Simone drove out to see her uncle, Robert Ashworth, her father's older brother, a retired construction inspector who had spent 30 years walking job sites looking for the mistakes other men tried to hide behind fresh paint. He listened to the whole thing on his back porch without interrupting once, the same porch where he and Walter used to argue about football and blueprints in equal measure. When she finished, Robert was quiet for a long moment. "He came to me 8 months ago," Robert finally said. "Asked me, real casual, whether I thought your father's firm could be valued and split in a divorce. I told him I didn't know anything about that. I called your father's old partner that same week and made sure the trust was airtight. Should have called you too. I'm sorry I didn't." "You didn't need to," Simone said. "Daddy already took care of it before either of us knew we'd need it." Robert nodded slowly. "Your daddy always did build for weather that hadn't come yet." "Real power," he told her before she left, "operated in quiet rooms, never loud ones." Back at the firm, Denise, an actual forensic accountant, a woman Simone had hired years earlier to review municipal contracts, spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly running numbers on Marcus's development company at Patricia's request. What she found went well past a simple affair. 3 of Marcus's active projects had been financed partly through Talia's family, and at least 2 of the disclosure documents submitted to those investors listed asset values that did not match the county's own property records by a combined $310,000. One signature on a subcontractor agreement had been copied and pasted from an earlier, unrelated document, badly enough that the font size didn't even match. There was more. Denise found a wire transfer, dated the week before Marcus moved his suitcases into the driveway, sending $18,000 from an investor escrow account into a personal checking account under Talia's name, categorized on the books as a consulting fee for services no contract on file described. It was the kind of entry that meant nothing to a casual glance, and everything to an auditor trained to notice when numbers were dressed up to look ordinary. Patricia read that page twice. "This isn't just a bad marriage anymore," she said. "This is a paper trail that could cost him his license." It wasn't just a marriage he had been building on sand. It was everything. Denise called again 2 days later, with one more detail she said Simone should hear before mediation. The insurance rider on the Cedar Street project had been renewed under a company name that didn't exist in the state's business registry. Not officially. Not yet. Marcus had been running on paperwork that hadn't finished catching up to the promises he'd already made 3 separate investors. He was not just behind on the truth with his wife. He was behind on it everywhere, and the walls were closing in on their own timeline, with or without anything Simone chose to do next. He built this whole thing assuming nobody would ever check, Patricia said. People like that usually only get caught by accident. "You're not an accident, Simone. You're a professional." That Sunday, Marcus came by the house to pick up the last of his tools, and his mother came with him, hopeful, the way mothers sometimes are, that a little civility might turn into reconciliation. Simone made coffee. She asked about his mother's garden. She asked Marcus, evenly, how his projects were going, and listened while he told her, with total confidence, that everything was finally coming together. She was watching. She poured him a second cup of coffee and said nothing at all about the folders sitting on a drive in her attorney's office, 3 miles away, with his name on it. Marcus's attorney had requested a private mediation room instead of open court, hoping for exactly the outcome most attorneys hope for when they represent a man who has underestimated his own wife for over a decade. Quiet, fast, cheap. He had no idea that Patricia had already filed to bring in outside counsel from the firm's corporate side, the attorneys who handled Ashworth Structural Group's contracts, because 2 of the projects still requiring Marcus's structural sign-offs happened to run through that very firm. Simone spent the week before mediation the way she spent most weeks, steady, deliberate, unremarkable to anyone watching. She went to work. She reviewed a load calculation on a mixed-use development downtown. She watered the tomatoes in the side yard, the ones her father had taught her to stake early so they wouldn't split under their own weight later in the season. Preparation, she thought, watching the tomatoes take hold, was simply patience with a plan attached. The mediation room was on the 9th floor of a downtown office building, all glass and gray carpet. The kind of room built to make people feel smaller than they were. Marcus arrived first with his attorney, visibly pleased with himself, arranging his folder on the table like a man setting up a presentation he was certain would land well. He had not expected Talia to be sitting in the waiting area when he walked in, nor had he expected his own mother to be there, having been invited by Simone's attorney as a courtesy. Nor had he expected Simone to walk in last, flanked by Patricia and Robert, carrying a slim leather folder that looked far too thin to contain what it actually did. He had no idea, walking into that room so certain of himself, exactly how much he did not know. Patricia opened without raising her voice, laying documents on the table one at a time, evenly spaced. Like a woman setting a table for a meal she already knew the guest wouldn't finish. The $212,000 moved out of joint accounts over 14 months. The $46,000 diverted into an account bearing Talia's name. The forged subcontractor signature blown up and printed at full size so the mismatched font was impossible to miss. The $18,000 wire dressed up as a consulting fee that no consulting had ever produced. Marcus's face went through the stages the way a building goes through the stages of collapse. First the confidence, still holding, Then, the first visible crack, small, around the eyes. Then, as Patricia set down the final page, the whole structure gave out at once. That final page was the one Robert had asked to be the one to explain, because he said Walter would have wanted it that way. Simone's father set up a trust 18 months before he passed, Robert said. Evenly, she's held 62% ownership of Ashworth Structural Group since the day he died. Not as some hidden fortune to brag about, as protection, in case a man like you ever came along. He let that sit in the room a moment. 2 of your active projects are waiting on structural sign-off from that firm right now, Robert added. Y'all didn't even bother to look up who actually owns it. Talia, who had been silent until then, turned to look at Marcus. You told me the money for the Cedar Street project was clean, she said quietly. You told me it was already approved. Marcus opened his mouth and closed it again. That's what I thought, Talia said, and did not look at him again for the rest of the meeting. Marcus tried, in the last stretch he had left, to reach for something softer. He said he still loved Simone. He said none of this was supposed to happen this way, that he had made mistakes, but the 2 of them had built something real once, and surely that counted for something. His mother, sitting quietly near the window the entire time, finally spoke. Marcus, she said, sit down and sign what your lawyer tells you to sign. You've said enough for one lifetime. Marcus sat back down slowly. The folder of paperwork his own attorney had prepared still open in front of him, useless now, filled with numbers that meant nothing next to the ones Simone had brought instead. He did not look at Talia. He did not look at his mother. He looked, for a moment, at nothing at all, the particular stillness of a man doing math on his own life and not liking any of the totals. Simone folded her hands on the table. Unhurried, you had 14 years to see who I actually was, she said. You chose to see what was convenient instead. That choice belongs to you now, not me. She stood. She gathered the thin folder that had done all the work it needed to do. She did not look at Talia. She did not look at Marcus's mother, though she nodded once, out of respect, on her way past. The room stayed silent behind her, full of paperwork that mapped, in exact and undeniable detail, the shape of everything Marcus had spent the last 2 years quietly demolishing, without ever once checking whether the foundation underneath him could actually hold. She did not look back. 8 months later, the house on Larkspur Lane had a new deck out back, built board by board with her father's old level and a borrowed miter saw. The wood cut slightly imperfect in places because she had done it herself and hadn't rushed a single piece of it. The tomatoes she had staked early that spring were splitting at the seams with their own weight by August, heavy and ready. Exactly the way her father always said patient things eventually got. Ashworth Structural Group had grown that year, not loudly, the way most real things grow. 2 new municipal contracts, a completed mid-rise downtown, and a new apprenticeship program funded with a $500,000 endowment in Walter Ashworth's name, training young engineers from the same working-class neighborhoods he had come up in himself. She had started seeing someone that spring, quietly, the way she did most things. Elijah Marsh was a forensic financial investigator, a calm, unhurried man she had met through Robert's church, who asked good questions and never once tried to perform for her. He didn't fill silences just to fill them. He noticed things and mostly kept that noticing to himself, which she had come, slowly, to trust. Marcus's ventures did not survive the year. The forensic audit Talia's family commissioned after the mediation, entirely separate from anything Simone had touched, found enough irregularities across his projects that 2 investors pulled out within a month and a 3rd filed suit. He lost his state contractor's license by summer, His mother stopped returning his calls somewhere around the time she found out he had asked Talia's cousin for a loan he had no real plan to repay. Talia moved back in with her parents by early summer. The Cedar Street condo she'd expected to move into instead sold at auction to cover what was owed. The last Simone heard, secondhand and unbothered, was that Marcus had taken a project manager job 2 rungs below anything he'd held before, working for a company that had no idea yet what kind of paperwork he tended to leave behind him. Simone heard about most of it secondhand, through Robert, the way a person hears weather reports for a city they no longer live in. She registered it. She did not linger on it. Then came the evening in September when she and Elijah were seated at a small restaurant downtown, waiting on their check, and Marcus walked in with Talia for what looked like a meeting with lawyers neither of them seemed happy to be having. Marcus's eyes moved across the room out of habit before they landed, and stopped on Elijah's face. He knew that face. He had sat across from it 3 days earlier in an emergency finance meeting, watching the same calm, unhurried man lay out, page by page, the forensic findings that had just cost him his last active investor. He had no idea, until that exact moment, how small a world could actually be. Marcus froze completely, the color leaving his face in the particular way it does when a man realizes the ground under him has finally, fully given out. He said nothing. He turned around before the host could even seat him, and Talia followed, asking a question he did not answer. Simone noticed. She didn't turn to watch him go. Later that night, back on the new deck, she sat with her coffee going cold beside her, listening to the quiet, and thought that some things really were worth the patience it took to build them right. She was free. She was solvent. She was exactly where she had always been building toward, whether anyone else had noticed the work or not. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.